All right. Well, Jim, let's get another question here. This one sent to CornyDriveThru@gmail.com from Steve in Manchester, UK. Who do you think was Ric Flair's greatest rival? Dusty Rhodes? He was just as charismatic and a great talker. The common man versus the rich, arrogant champion was great storytelling. Ricky Steamboat? Created technically spectacular matches and a legendary trilogy from 1989. Terry Funk? Two huge names with Flair as the babyface, wild fights, and something a little different from Flair. So those are the three options there from Steve in Manchester. Jim, the greatest rival for Ric Flair.
There is no particular one. It depends on what you're looking at. Ric Flair and Ricky Steamboat, from a standard of in-ring athletic competition in 1989, was the gold standard and the best, I think, that pro wrestling has ever been. It was wide open enough to be entertaining, while still almost everything that was done could legitimately be be part of a conflict. What I'm saying is, when wrestling went farther than Flair and Steamboat, there was obvious cooperation involved, and you lost some believability. Flair and Steamboat also, conversely, went as far as you could to make an athletic contest entertaining. I think that was probably the perfect balance. I don't know that it's been matched since then. But that didn't draw the most money. That was Flair and Dusty. Of all of the rivals that Flair had when he was champion, from 81 to whatever his last run was in WCW, early 90s, or in the WWF, the only rival that Flair had that was a bigger box office star, really, than Dusty would have been Hogan and arguably Savage. And Flair and Hogan and Flair and Savage didn't draw as much money as Flair and Dusty did, even though it was in the WWF.
What about Harley?
Well, Flair and Harley, I couldn't tabulate the money they drew. It was up there. But at the same time, I don't think it didn't last as long, and it wasn't as hot as Flair and Dusty, as far as people cheering the babyface, booing the heel, and having to see the rematch, and et cetera, et cetera. And it wasn't technically as brilliant as Flair and Steamboat, because Flair and Wyndham would be in there for a technical standpoint if it hadn't been for Steamboat. If it wasn't for Flair and Steamboat in 89, Flair and Steamboat in 87 may have been the best.
Flair and Wyndham.
Or Flair and Wyndham, yes. I'm sorry. Flair and Wyndham in 87 may have been the best NWA world title matches in the ring that anybody ever had. But they didn't draw the money that Flair and Dusty did. Even though they drew better than Flair and Steamboat did because of the timing. Flair and Wyndham got to work for Crockett while the things were hot. Flair and Steamboat had to work for WCW under TBS and Jim Herd when things had drastically cooled off.
And as much as I love Terry Funk, and I love the Terry Funk-Ric Flair feud, I don't think you could put Terry Funk on a list of the top greatest rivals, just because it was only one run and was relatively short.
Right, and I mean, they had wrestled before in, a few times in history, but it wasn't like that they had a long run. Funk and Dusty was a much longer running rivalry than Flair and Funk, and people put Terry in that equation because the matches they did have were so good and so different from what Flair was normally doing, and the angle was so good. And just seeing Terry Funk back on national TV in 1989, people were losing their shit, and rightfully so. But he wasn't a long-term career rival or a mega box office, situation with Rick. And then, I mean, you can go back to the Carolinas in the 70s before Rick was really national, where he had the rivalry with Valentine after they broke up, and matches with Steamboat when Steamboat was a babyface.
Mulligan.
And or I'm sorry, matches with Snuka, rather. When Snuka was a babyface, what I'm trying to say. And as well as Steamboat in the Steamboat matches in the 80s surpassed the Steamboat matches in the 70s because they had so much more experience. And plus the video quality is so much better. Mulligan was one of the biggest draws that Flair had as an opponent when they switched Mulligan babyface after Flair and Mulligan had been together for so long. And that drew more money than him and Flair and Piper or Flair and Snuka or Flair and Steamboat in the Carolinas or whatever. But the matches, it was Blackjack Mulligan's match and Ric Flair bumping. But as a matter of fact, he told me himself, Flair did. When the Midnight and the Rock and Roll sold out the Charlotte Coliseum February 2nd of 1986 for our first match with them in Charlotte, that was the first legitimate full sellout of the Charlotte Coliseum for wrestling since Flair and Mulligan had done it in 1978. And Flair and Mulligan drew big business in every town in the territory. But the matches weren't nearly as good as Flair and Funk or Flair and Steamboat or Flair and Snook or whatever. So you can't really quantify something like that and say who was the greatest rival. Then in what criteria are you judging? Drawing money, having the epitome of a great pro wrestling match, somewhere in the length of the rivalry. It's not, you can't pin it down.
Yeah, greatest rival. How about Bischoff?
Yeah, and that could be, depending on your criteria, Ric Flair's greatest rivals could have been Eric Bischoff or Jim Herd. The people running the promotion that he spent, the most of the 90s in. Those were his biggest enemies. Those were the reasons why that Flair had some dark periods during the 90s and even left the company a time or two. So those could have been his biggest rivals.
I would also put the Von Erichs as a whole on that list, because although everyone focuses on Flair and Kerry, it was Flair and David, Flair and Kevin, Flair and Kerry, St. Louis, Dallas, Tokyo. I mean, they wrestled all over the place. And
very good point.
Mid-South.
Just Flair and the Von Erich family, because of multiple territories over a number of years, and including setting at the time, the all-time North American gate record with Kerry. So, yeah, that's got to come in there too. And the matches were good. With
him and Kerry? Oh, yeah.
Well, I'm saying the matches were good with all the Von Erichs. Kevin was a great athlete also, and David was the worker. The match that set the record in Texas Stadium that everybody remembers was the worst match Flair and Kerry ever had, because they only went like fucking 12 minutes because they wanted it on TV, and they had, so many other matches that day.
A backslide.
Yeah.
A title change on a back. That's the thing I never understood. Do the title change. The fans there, they want it. It's the right thing to do at the right time. Why was that the finish?
Well, but once again, even though Flair was a miracle worker back in those days, all the Von Erichs finishes were, when we got there, we left Bill Watts, who learned finishes from Eddie Graham and Roy Shire, and went to work for Ken Mantell, booking for the Von Erichs, where every finish was pick him up for a body slam, but the other guy super kicks him and down you go, or sunset flip, or small package, or what. When the Fantastics and the Midnight started doing their shit, because we'd worked with them before and also we wanted to achieve, they would give us a sunset flip finish and we'd do, some shit in front of it that made the sunset flip exciting. But I'll tell you this story and we can move on. Hint, hint. So Kerry comes up to Oklahoma City and Tulsa one day to work for Watts, because the world-class TV is on in the Oklahoma markets too, and all those talents were big there. And Kerry and Flair set the record in Tulsa, the gate record in Tulsa, a couple months after we set it with the Rock and Roll, a couple months after we set it with Watts and Dog. Anyway, so Dundee's the booker. So he goes in the babyface locker room, because babyface and heels were separate. And he's given finishes. But he comes up to Kerry, and he's just visiting there. He's just working with someone on the card, just to be a name on the card. So Dundee says, Kerry, you're going over. What do you want to do? How about a sunset flip? Okay, mate, you got it. And then Dundee goes around and talks to, some of the other boys, and he's fixing to head out to go over to the heel locker room. And Kerry stops him. Hey, Bill. Yep. What was that finish again?
The finish he gave him, the sunset flip. Yeah.
Sunset flip. One he came up with. And Dundee comes straight over the other side. Was like, listen to what he just, But so you didn't make it complicated, and you called it as it went, because the boys were not going to. I was told that's why that the office started giving written directions to all the spot shows that Dallas ran, because if the boys went to the town and went to a school and it wasn't the school that the matches were being held at, they'd just turn around and go back to Dallas sometimes.
Now that's amazing, and I want to spell that out a little bit. If there was a house show at a school and the Von Erichs decided they were going to go work that show but went to the wrong school, they would just go home instead of figuring out where the right school was.
Bronco Lubitsch had told me that had happened at least once. So anyway, so you, with your booking sheet for all the spot shows that we only ran like once a year or every great once in a while, you got a strip of paper with, they typed out the directions from Dallas and Xeroxed it. They had to give, we'd never before or since did we ever get directions to a fucking town that we were booked in. But they couldn't just give, I was told, they couldn't just give the Von Erichs the written directions and make them look like Ned, so they gave them to everybody. And it helped out, but we were capable of finding this shit on our own. Everybody had a road atlas in their car, and these small towns, when you pull in, you stop at a gas station. Where's the so-and-so county high school? That's all you got to do.
Well, Jim, that's going to be our final question, but I think that's going to be an interesting segment. We're going to do this again next week, and I'm going to give you a heads up now so you can think about it. Next week, I'm going to ask you a question, because I like this one. You could have as many as you want, but we're going to narrow it down to the top 3. Who are the top 3 career rivals of Dusty Rhodes? We'll do that on next week's Drive-Thru.
Okay. All righty then.
But let's wrap up.
We'll get some feedback.
Well, I don't want their feedback. The feedback's usually awful. Let's just go with what we have in our head.
Our fans are smart. We've established this. They're well-read, learned.
I agree.
Have high IQs.
Absolutely. Keep your feedback to yourselves.